Hello everyone, I am Dr. Sathyanarayan Rao and I am currently working as a research associate at Indian Institute of Science with Professor Shekhar Muddu in the Department of Civil Engineering. And during my time here, I had the opportunity to visit Berambadi watershed from 2022 to 2023. It was a field campaign where I had to collect some field measured soil moisture data. In addition to my own measurements, we also had access to satellite data from Sentinel and also from L-band allows to pulsar satellite from 2018 and from 2022 and 23 onwards. So altogether, like this data set was around 650 to 670 paired observation. So for each satellite backscatter, we had the field measured soil moisture data. And in this presentation, I will talk about how I used random forest regression to predict soil moisture from satellite backscatter, and also I had to engineer some new features like the difference between the satellite backscatter of different polarization and other things. I also want to discuss the role of different soil texture or different radar bands and also the land cover types, because some of the data was on bare soil and some data was on vegetation. So let's start with how the data was collected. So how we collected the soil moisture data is that we used a field probe and did what's called as the triangle method. Basically, for each sampling spot, we take 3 measurements in a triangle and then average them to get a single value for that agricultural plot. So we made sure that we visited the field on the same date as the satellite passes above us, and so our field measured soil moisture should line up with the satellite backscatter data for that exact date and place. And now if we look at what data we have, in total we have 677 samples. The data set, for instance, here in the panel A, I show the distribution of backscatter value for HH and HV channels. So that's horizontally transmitted and horizontally received is the HH, while when the satellite transmits horizontally but receives in vertical polarization, it's the HV. These values are in decibels, which is why they are in negative, because the radar signal becomes very weak by the time it reaches back to the satellite after hitting the ground. And we also see that HH values are a bit more negative as compared to HV, but we have a decent spread. So this is a good news because we have a spread of backscatter value, which should give machine learning a good data set. And the difference between HH and HV also tells us about the soil surface roughness or other details that we will discuss when we talk about the feature engineering. Now if we look at panel B, this shows actually how many samples we have for each soil texture for different radar band. So we got like 5 soil types: clay, sandy clay, and other things. You will also notice that it's not perfectly balanced. Loamy sand has very low samples, barely over 50, while other soil samples are around 200. And also we have a lot more C-band data as compared to L-band data. But in typical field data, we should work with what we have. And in panel C, we have the distribution of soil moisture across all the samples. Most of our data actually is between 0 and 20%. So we are not seeing too many super wet or super dry classes. It's more realistic field scale variability. And in the panel D, we show the land cover. 2/3 of our samples were from vegetated fields and only 1/3 were bare soil. With this dataset, we are going to test if random forest model can predict soil moisture accurately and whether it helps to make separate models for different soil textures, radar bands, and land covers. So first we will train the random forest regression on the whole dataset as one model, and then we will break it down by soil texture, radar band, and land cover, just to see if we get any improvement or interesting patterns. So it's an exploratory analysis that we are doing in this presentation. So after we have our soil moisture data and the satellite data, so next is we should see if we can predict soil moisture using the random forest regression. So in random forest model, it's actually it has contains lot of decision trees, like lots of little if then rules, and then we average lot of if and then rules to get the result based on lot of decision trees that are actually randomly chosen. And this is quite widely used, and it's good for complicated and messy data. And it's also helpful for our case because the relationship between satellite data and soil moisture is not always linear. And so what we did is, first I made a generic model, meaning that I throw all 600 odd samples together, no matter what type of soil, what type of satellite band or land cover, to the random forest and ask it to predict soil moisture, as if we ignore all the sub details. So this is a baseline model that I call it as the generic model. And second, I also made separate models for each soil texture like clay, sandy, loam, etc., and tuned them individually. I also like in machine learning, we have something called as feature, which means that it's the input that we give to the machine learning model. In our case, these are the satellite backscatter values, and the more feature, it's always sometimes better. So we did something called as feature engineering, which means that we create new inputs with the existing ones. For example, I can create polarization ratio HV by HH. This actually helps to see how radar's response change depending on the orientation. Sometimes this can also highlight differences in soil structure or soil moisture. And I also created a new feature called as the total power, which is the HH and HV, sum of HH and HV. This is the measure of overall signal strength. And I also created a new feature called as SAR contrast, where it is HH minus HV. This can actually tell differences between that are related to soil texture or surface roughness. And we also actually standardized everything to zero mean and unit variance, so that all the features should be on the same scale, so that the decision tree can do its work. And it's a pretty common procedure to scale all the features before we train the model. And how did we evaluate the model is by using R square, which is it tells us the percentage of variation in the soil moisture that can be explained by model's prediction. So if R square is 1, it means perfect prediction, and 0 means model is no better than guessing the average. And root mean square error is we had, which tells me how far our prediction is from the real soil moisture values that were measured in the field. We also actually look at the feature importance scores and check the correlation between each feature and the soil moisture to see if there is a strong relationship. So these are the things we do to evaluate our model. And so now let's see what results I got by running this model. So before I actually go into the random forest or machine learning, I just wanted to check if there is actually a meaningful link between the radar backscatter from the satellite and the field measured soil moisture, and whether this link actually changes depending on the soil type or the radar band, or if the land is bare or vegetated. So here I am showing you in this plot the correlation between the field measured soil moisture and the radar backscatter, specifically the HH polarization. Now you may ask why focus on HH? Because I found that HH showed me a stronger and more consistent relationship with the soil moisture. And also in the most studies, it's the most informative feature. And in our dataset too, HH was the most informative feature, as we can see in the later slides. So that's why I chose HH here. And what we see here is that for entire dataset, If I lump all the data set and compute the correlation between HH and the soil moisture, it was around 0.59, which is actually decent. But when I break down the data by soil type, it jumps to 0.76 for sandy loam, and for loamy sand also it's around 0.7. Now, when I check what happens if we split the data by radar band or by whether the soil is bare or has vegetation, these splits actually is below the overall average we can see here. So this red dotted line is the average correlation, and everything is below the correlation value except the loamy sand and the sandy loam. So the main key takeaway from this figure is that the soil type actually drives how well the radar can pick up the soil moisture. And it's not so much the band or the land cover. That's what we see in this data set. And that's why in the next step, we will see if building soil-specific random forest models can give us better prediction, rather than treating all the soils the same way. So here I am showing you the results of our random forest modeling. On the x-axis, what you see here is the different models. One is the generic model, where we built one model using all data together, and then separate model for each soil texture type like clay, sandy, loam, and so on. And now we used the random forest, which is a computer algorithm that looks for patterns in the data to predict the soil moisture based on the satellite measurement and other features that we discussed earlier. And what is the y-axis is the R-square. It's a way of measuring how close our predicted soil moisture was to the real field measured value. An R-square of 1 means perfect prediction. 0 means the predictions are no better than guessing the average value. And a negative value means the model is doing even worse than that. So in our results, what we see is that the generic model, that's the one with all data mixed, gets an R-square of 0.45. That means that 45% of differences in soil moisture that we measured in the field can be explained by the model prediction. That's actually decent by remote sensing standards, especially with all the varieties in our dataset. So what about the other ones? Only with model trained specifically for sandy loam soil, it clearly gives us better results of 0.6. That's a 34% improvement over the generic model. It means that our predictions line up much better with actual measurements in the sandy loam soils. The models for clay, sandy clay, and other textures actually does not improve that much. In fact, actually they do worse than the generic model. And in some cases, R-square is even negative, for example, in sandy clay. And we also computed RMSE. It was around 9%, 9 to 10%. It tells us how far our predicted soil moisture is from the actual value. So it was around 8 to 10%. So it's a standard in remote sensing study. They are in line with what's expected. And why we think that sandy loam is better, like from the study? Actually, this matches with what we saw earlier. Sandy loam soils had the highest correlation even before we did any machine learning. So this is because the radar signal is more sensitive to changes in soil moisture in sandy loam. So that may be a reason why it's easy for the model to learn that relationship. In clay soil, the connection is much weaker. The connection between the changes in soil moisture to the radar signal might be weaker and more complicated. So our random forest is not figuring out the complex relation, but in sandy loam, it's figuring out that. So from this figure, we can take away this message that only sandy loam soil really benefits from making a separate soil specific model. For most other soil texture, actually it's very good that we stick with the generic model that we trained for all the data. So up to now we saw that the sandy loam soils were actually showing better results in terms of even simple correlation, as well as when we tried the random forest. the R square for sandy loam was much higher than the other soil types, which already suggested that relationship between satellite data and ground measurement is strongest in sandy loam. So here I wanted to go a step further. In machine learning, actually, sometimes throwing all possible input features into a model isn't actually the best strategy. Sometimes some features can be more harmful than they are useful. They can actually confuse the model and hurt the model performance. So I wanted to see, what if we pick two best features for each soil type? Could that do any better than using all the features? So what we did was, for each soil texture, I tested every possible combinations of two features from our SAR data. Things like polarization ratio, SAR contrast, total power, HH and HV. So for every pair, I ran random forest model and checked the R square, which is the measure of how well the model prediction matched the actual measured soil moisture. Here again, 0 means there is no learning, 1 means it's perfectly predict everything. So in this table, I show which pair of features was best for each soil type, depending on the best R square that the pair achieved. The full range of R square value I saw for all possible pairs is also shown. And for comparison, I also have the previous result where R square you get when you use all the features together. So what do we see here is that for sandy loam, that's the best performer of 0.67. When we use the best feature was the polarization ratio and the SAR contrast. And for each soil type, we have different best feature pair that gives the best R square here. For clay or mixed soil, even the very best feature pair couldn't get above 0.3, let's say, if you see here. Sometimes using the best feature is better than using all features, like in loamy sand. Even in sandy clay, it's better, but even in clay. So sometimes feature engineering is not needed. That's what this table tells. Sometimes it doesn't help, but if you see the best R square, best pair R square, it's always better than the all feature R square except for sandy clay. So in short, this table actually highlights, especially for sandy soil, picking the right input is also important, and also training the model for soil texture specific data. It's also important if we have sandy soil. Sandy loam, actually the best feature and the specifically trained model is better than using all features and a generic model. So far we have seen that sandy loam soil consistently performed better. We looked at simple features, all feature, random forest, and the best feature pairs. In this section, we will see what happens when we focus on the sandy loam soil alone. And in the first, let's recap. What we have in panel A is the correlation of HH backscatter with the soil moisture for each soil type, because HH was the best feature that we saw from the correlation. And in the panel B, it's R square for each soil type, how well the random forest predicts, not just for sandy loam but for other models, and sandy loam is the best performer here. And I haven't put the average model, it was around 0.5 or something. Only sandy loam exceeds the average or generic random forest model. This is what we have seen so far. And in C and D, we are specifically zooming in on sandy loam. In panel C, we have the feature importance for sandy loam only. And again, HH is the most important feature for the random forest model, followed by HV, polarization ratio. Total power is also significantly slightly better, and SAR contrast. And panel D shows the observed versus the predicted soil moisture, again just for the sandy loam. This sandy loam data was around 170 data points. I split them into training and test dataset and trained a dedicated random forest model just for this texture in panel C and D. After training, this was actually checked to predict on new unseen data, the test data set. And the results is okay, like we get around 0.6 R square. In simple terms, that means the model can explain 60% of variability in the real soil moisture measurement using only the radar information from Sentinel satellite or ALAS pulsar. And in this study, the RMSE was around 8%. So on average, the model prediction are off by 8 to 9% of the soil moisture, which I show in the plot D in the text here. For remote sensing or hydrology application, this is okay, not too bad. If you remember, for generic model, R square was 0.45, and here we have an R square for sandy loam at 0.6, which is actually 34% improvement just by focusing on sandy loam soils. So this is the main key message, that sandy loam is the best performing soil type. And if you have a region dominated by sandy loam, you can be confident that random forest will work better. You can separate all sandy loam and train a dedicated model for that. That's what this picture is showing us. But for other textures, as we saw, the results are not that strong as compared to a generic model. So for other textures, you can lump all the soils and train a generic model and run it. But if you have sandy loam dominated region, we can specifically separate it and train dedicated models. So this is like telling when soil specific calibration is worth doing in hydrological monitoring. So here our study suggests that sandy loam soil deliver much better accuracy as compared to generic model, and the feature importance tells us that HH backscatter is the main driver for predictions in these soils. And here the observed and predicted soil moisture also shows that it works really good on unseen field data. This is what we see for the test data set, which the machine learning model is not seen it. It was trained on a subset of data and then asked to predict here. And it's quite good with an R square of 0.596. So as a conclusion, let's actually try to bring together everything that we have learned from this presentation. So what we did was we started with 677 paired measurements of satellite radar data and soil moisture, all collected in the same field on the same day as the satellite passed overhead. And we split these data by different soil type using the USDA classification, and then tested, does it help to make separate machine learning models for each soil texture, or is one generic model good enough? And what we find is that for sandy loam soil, making texture specific machine learning model like random forest gives us much better prediction. It was about 34% improvement in the accuracy over the generic model. And in practical terms, if you are working in areas dominated by sandy loam or loamy sand, which actually makes up about 40% of Berambadi watershed, and is also very common soil across many parts of India, a texture-specific machine learning model really improves our prediction. And for other soils, actually a generic model is better and more effective. And also, among the radar features we looked at, the HH polarization of the backscatter was consistently the most important single input for the machine learning model. But if we see the combination of features, it actually differed for different soil type. The polarization ratio actually popped up as a favorite thing for model. It was actually showing up for many soil types. So what it means is that sometimes engineering the new features can help model learn better. It's not a new thing, it's very common in machine learning. And I would like to thank Professor Shekhar Muddu for his support, the reward project for funding my data collection, and all the students, especially the colleague Saundar Rajan, who also helped me with the data collection in the Berambadi watershed. At a later stage, I will put a preprint or description in the video below once I finalize all my findings into a manuscript. I'm still in the process of writing this for a journal submission as a short communication paper. So if you have some feedback or if you find this interesting, please check it and you can share your feedback if you have any. Thanks for watching and listening. And I hope it gives you a good idea of how we can use machine learning and satellite data for soil moisture monitoring. Thank you very much.